Andrew McCarthy wrote a piece this weekend for the New York Post on proportionality. And since it is so widely used and so wrongly misunderstood, I asked him to join me, and he does. Good morning, Andy. Thank you for coming on.
Hugh, it's my pleasure.
Proportionality is a rule of reason, not of surrender. That's a fine closing line in your essay. Would you tell people why we're even talking about this and then explain what it is? Because I do know a little bit about this. I don't like to do criminal defense, but I do know a little bit about the law of war. And I don't think anyone but you has gotten it right.
Yeah, well, I think, the reason for that is that this has been a bugaboo of mine since after 9/11, because what we're hearing this weekend is precisely the same thing that we heard beginning when we finally, after the 9/11 attacks, recognized that the struggle we were in was more of a national security and military challenge than a courtroom situation. And, of course, the response then was that we were being disproportionate in our military response in Afghanistan and later Iraq. And to hear the left tell it, and it's not just the left, it's Islamists and leftists combined, but to hear them tell it, what the laws of war, which contain the principle of proportionality, to hear them tell it is like a tit-for-tat thing, so that the aggressor gets to determine how much response is appropriate by the responding military force, and can kind of cap the military response in a kind of like an eye for an eye sort of way. And that's not what proportionality means at all. What proportionality means is that a military commander is supposed to single out legitimate military objectives. And when you're deciding what force to use in hitting a military objective, you are supposed to try to minimize civilian casualties. But it doesn't mean that you can't hit the target. You have to hit the target if it's a legitimate military objective. And it doesn't mean that if there are going to be civilian damage to civilians or civilian infrastructure that you can't hit it. But it means that you're supposed to try to contain your warfare response to subjects that or targets that have military value. And when you're fighting an outfit like Hamas, the fact of the matter is they have their arsenal and the way that they fire their arsenal spread among civilian infrastructure. So it's inevitable, and it's, this is why people say war is hell. Of course it is, but it's inevitable that in order to respond to that, you're going to have to hit those targets. And Israel, I think, is doing more than any country in the world would do, including us, frankly, in terms of like making sure they go the extra mile to minimize civilian casualties. I think they're doing it to the point where they're actually going to miss some of the legitimate targets that they have to hit if they want to destroy Hamas. But they are doing it to minimize civilian casualties. They still have to hit these targets.
And Andy, I summarize it. If you're in a just war, and Israel is, you are obliged to minimize civilian loss of life, innocent loss of life. And civilian, that line gets very, very shady when you're dealing with terrorist people. It doesn't matter if they're not wearing a uniform, if they're a terrorist or supporting the terrorists. And you do not have to support the civilian population in which they are hiding. Israel cut off the water and international pressure began. They restored the water in the south because they want Gaza residents to move to the south of Gaza because they're going to the north of Gaza. But there is no obligation not to kill civilians. I just put people back in World War II. We didn't stop at the Rhine, Andy, and
Right.
we firebombed Tokyo. There were a lot of innocent Tokyo, but we were not going to sacrifice our men coming ashore, including my dad, and I don't know about yours. They were not going to get blown up and killed by a last-ditch Japanese stand because we didn't want to use the nuclear weapon that would kill innocent people. Proportionality does not mean what I mean. I haven't even seen it used right once.
Right. Well, because people, you have people who are consciously trying to deceive the public about what this means. And what they're saying ostensibly doesn't sound unreasonable. You know, people get told that, well, you're supposed to be proportionate in your military response. If you're not somebody who is steeped in the laws of war, you can be duped into believing what that means is that when one side has offensive operations against the other in response can't overdo it. That may make sense to people, at least, on a certain surface level. But if you think about it in terms of common sense, the laws of war are not aimed at having a stalemate where a military force that could win has its hands tied, by some goofy concept that says that you can't do more than the enemy has done.
No, this really took root because of droning, right? Obama got heat for droning people, and ever since then, the left has been against the idea that you might kill an innocent civilian in the course of prosecuting a war. And I remember Abbey Gate; they did not take the shot at the suicide bomber because they were afraid they were wrong. It does paralyze militaries, and Israel refuses to be paralyzed, Andy.
Well, yeah, but they're also being very humanitarian and reasonable.
Very. Yep.
But in the end, I think what you're saying is, and I couldn't agree with this more. They are doing this at some compromise to the combat effectiveness that the laws of war would allow them to have, which they feel like they have to do for both public consumption and because, frankly, we have a leftist administration in Washington, which is giving them, I think, behind the scenes a very hard time. The mere fact that we haven't had this ground operation really begin in earnest yet is an indication to me that there's a lot going on behind the scenes where, our government may be saying some of the right things publicly, but, this idea behind the scenes that they can't go in until there's a satisfactory corridor that's opened up so that people can get out, which would inevitably mean Hamas jihadists can also get out, is insane. But I do think they need our support, and they're being squeezed behind the scenes.
I think you're right. In fact, there's a story in Ynet this morning of Israel that we have dissuaded Israel from a preemptive strike on Hezbollah and have sent the carrier strike groups there as sort of a comfy blanket, a security blanket. But we haven't committed to using the force, Andy. I don't think President Biden is doing what he needs to do to deter Hezbollah in Iran at this point. Do you?
Well, no. I think we're giving them material support. I mean, they're out there saying, we're not sure that Iran really had anything to do with this. And this is like the old Washington game. They can't acknowledge that, the truth that's plain in front of everybody's face, because if they acknowledge it, then they have to do something about it, which they don't want to do. So we're supposed to all pretend that even though Iran funds Hamas and supplies Hamas with weapons and gives them training, and Hezbollah works with them, and Hezbollah trains them in the Bekaa Valley, we're all supposed to pretend that an additional thing we have to show is that there was some conversation in which the Ayatollah spoke with Haniya in Qatar or wherever the conversation happened and gave him the green light to go ahead, as if, we're supposed to ignore everything else and suspend disbelief, to believe that Hamas, which depends on Iran as part of its lifeline, would actually pull off or haul off and do an attack like they did on October 7th without letting Iran know, under circumstances where that attack could very well have been taken by Israel and others to, they could have instantly decided that Iran obviously had to be behind it and have attacked Iran over it. So
yes.
The thought that Hamas would do this without tipping Iran off and making sure it was okay when they depend on Iran is fairyland.
Yeah, and I also don't believe they're telling us the truth on what they know. Andy, a week from now, the war will have widened. I expect proportionality to keep coming up, and I hope people go and get the link at Hugh Hewitt account on Twitter and send it to everyone, because that's the best succinct statement on proportionality and what it does and does not mean that I've seen. And thank you for joining me this morning. Andrew C. McCarthy on X, the site formerly known as Twitter, Andrew C. McCarthy. Thank you, Andy.